and it's published 1991. I will just make two quotations for you. If you compare them over time, you will see, in fact, the difference, the shift, very fundamental shift in American public opinion. I will take just a couple. The public asked whether sympathy was more with Israel or the Palestinians. 34% of public respondents said Israel. 13% sympathized more with the Palestinians. 7% volunteered both, and 26% volunteered neither. Now, the same question asked in 1974 resulted in 86% sympathy with Israel, as against 34%, and about 5% with Palestinians. So there's one shift. Among the leadership sample, that's not the public, the leadership, the informed opinion, sympathies were about evenly divided. 33% sympathized with Israel, and 35% with the Palestinians. More. A dramatic shift from 1982, when leaders sympathized with Israel by a 42 to 26%. Complete reversal. As already noted, Israel was rated mildly favorable at 54 degrees on the thermometer. They measured the feeling. A slip from 61 degrees in 78 and 59 degrees in 86. Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir was given a cool rating of 44 degrees. They don't like him. Okay. There was one notable exception to these and other indications of a more critical stance toward Israel in our survey. A larger proportion of the public than ever before, 43%, expressed willingness to use U.S. troops if Arab forces invaded Israel, although this 43% did not constitute a majority. 43% were also opposed. It did signify a sharp increase. The balance of support for economic aid to Israel tipped toward cutting back. You know, Israel gets about $4 to $5 billion a year of economic and military assistance from the United States. It's the largest single recipient of foreign aid from the United States. The balance of support for economic aid to Israel tipped toward cutting back, with 45% of the public in favor of decreasing or altogether stopping aid. That's why President Bush was able, in fact, to take the position that he did on his refusal to extend the loan guarantees to Israel, $10 billion that they have been asking for, and that now Israel seems to have given up on. This does remain consistent with the public's overall reluctance to support economic aid to other countries. Leaders favored cutting back or stopping economic aid to Israel by 54%, with 41% in favor of keeping it the same and 4% in favoring an increase. If Israel does not negotiate a settlement, that is on the issue of the settlement, with regard to the issue of the Israeli occupied territories and the possibility of a Palestinian homeland, of the four choices given, let Israel do what it thinks best: exert diplomatic pressure, reduce economic and military assistance if Israel does not negotiate a settlement, the answer, and cut off all economic and military aid if Israel does not negotiate a settlement. 24% of the public and 6% of the leaders said the U.S., quote, should not pressure Israel. 24% should not pressure Israel at all and should let Israel pursue whatever policy it thinks best. 37% of the public and 57% of the leaders favored something beyond diplomatic pressure, either reducing economic and military assistance if Israel does not negotiate a settlement, 20% and 50% respectively, or cutting it off completely, 17% and 7% of the leaders. So there is a clear shift, in domestic shift, which now, in fact, constitutes the support for the policy that the President has pursued on the issue of the loan guarantees. That is, in all the public opinion polls that I examine and that are available to everybody, and I think the administration is aware of, there is a direct connection between America's political leadership for a peace process and its ability to exercise leverage. And the leverage is clearly the money that the United States gives to Israel. By some estimates, the United States has given to Israel about $55 billion since 1967, by other estimates, depending on how you count. So there is considerable power that the United States has that if it wishes to use to make that peace process a successful one. Whether it's doing so today or not, I think in the coming sessions of the peace conference, we'll see the direction of this pressure. Now, what are the issues that are to be negotiated in this process? I summed them up. I mean, it's clear that you have to deal with the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. But in terms of the Arabs, since the peace conference, the peace process, in fact, is a comprehensive one. It deals with all the occupied territories, that is the Golan, Lebanon, that is Syria and Lebanon, Jordan. It means that the aspiration, certainly, of the peace process is to achieve a comprehensive peace between Israel, the Palestinians, and all the other Arab states that have been historically at war with it. Now, the single most important issue is the occupation of land. I sum up the issues that they have to come to grips with in the negotiating process as being three issues: the issue of people, the issue of land, and the issue of political sovereignty. These are the three issues. The people, it means that Palestinians and the Israelis, who are the Palestinians, I mentioned there are 6 million. They have a specific experience, historic experience of dispossession and exile, subjugation, fratricide, politicide. These are common experience to all the Palestinians that must be addressed. And the only way you can address these issues is to have a total solution for the Palestinian question in the form of an independent state. Now, whether Israel is free to import all its immigrants and transform the demographic structure of the country in such a decisive manner as to make it impossible for the Palestinians to stay on the land, this is also an issue that must be addressed. That security is not to be confused, in fact, with the alteration of the structure of the country itself, demographically and economically. That's issue number one. Issue number two is the land. Now, it's easy for me to say the West Bank and Gaza, assuming everybody knows what that West Bank and Gaza is. Well, yes. But then when you come to grips with the issue, does East Jerusalem belong to the West Bank or does it not? Israel has already annexed East Jerusalem. For Israel, it considers East Jerusalem, that it occupied in 1967, as part of Israel. Does it have to renounce it? Does it have to give it back, as the Palestinians say, so that the East Jerusalem will in fact become the capital of the independent Palestinian state? Or it remains the eternal capital of the state of Israel in its totality? Now, people say that Jerusalem will be the most difficult issue. Well, it is difficult, but it's no more difficult than the West Bank and Gaza or any other territory. It's symbolically important. It's a very important issue, but it's no more difficult. That's the principle of the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by force, which the United States government adheres to, which is the basis of Resolution 242, is to be implemented. Clearly, Israel will have to withdraw from East Jerusalem, because East Jerusalem was occupied in 1967. The Golan is part of Syria's national domain. I don't believe that there is a single government in Syria that is willing to compromise on the issue of the liberation of the Golan. It's part of the national territory of Syria. It was occupied in 1967. 1981, it was annexed by Israel. It is now part of Israel. It's colonized by settlers. We don't hear much about it in the media, but there are about 13 to 15,000 colonial settlers sitting in the Golan in settlements, and therefore Syria demands the evacuation of the Golan by Israeli troops and the restoration of Syria's sovereignty over its national domain. Lebanon. Lebanon is occupied today. Probably 20% of it is occupied, either directly or by free at the discretion of the Israeli army. It can come in any time, or by proxy. It has a puppet regime established in the south of Lebanon. It exercises a great deal of control indirectly over Lebanon, that it conducts air raids on Lebanese national soil at will. Well, the Lebanese government once signed a peace treaty with Lebanon, with Israel in 1983, signed actually a peace treaty. It was even ratified by the Lebanese parliament. It was negotiated under the auspices of Secretary of State Scholz. It reflected the weight of military conquest. As soon as Lebanon was able, that is when the president of Lebanon, who collaborated in that, vacated office, and the national movement, in fact, assumed greater power, the Lebanese parliament, the same parliament, renounced that treaty because it represented the right of the conqueror. It was a dictated peace. Well, that territory now is reduced in scope, but still Israel is there. The Lebanese delegate, the foreign minister who sat in Washington and is likely to sit again, has only one item on the agenda. You get out of there, and we restore the national authority of the Lebanese government over our territory. And there is no negotiation. They are stuck. The Land for Peace formula that President Bush has offered entails the withdrawal of Israeli troops from all these territories. The statement that I quoted from Mr. Scholz on the resolution 242 and 338 is the framework of the peace conference. To follow it means that in return for the withdrawal, the end of the occupation, you have full peace between the adversaries. That's one issue. You have the issue of people, you have the issue of land. The final issue is clearly political sovereignty. And in that case, we are talking, in fact, about the sovereignty of the Palestinian people over their national domain, their own territory, the sovereignty of Syria over its territory, and the sovereignty of Lebanon, and clearly the sovereignty of Israel over the territory that the other parties accept. Because the peace that must be negotiated must be voluntarily arrived at. The question that I think I want to pose and then eventually conclude is the kind of peace that envisages, in fact, the withdrawal of Israel from the occupied territories, that accept the legitimacy of the Palestinian state and the Palestinian right to self-determination. Is it possible to bring about in the conditions that exist today? And why would Israel agree? Why would the Arabs agree in the way they have agreed to enter the peace conference on the terms that had been outlined by Mr. Baker and outlined essentially by President Bush? They were not willing to do so in 1980. They were not willing to do so in 1977. Why are they willing to do it now? Well, I think there are a couple, and I won't go into a detailed explanation, but I think there are a couple of considerations that I'd like you to think about. But I think the most decisive, there is one factor that's most decisive, which the Intifada has clarified. Palestinian uprising since 1987, in fact, has demonstrated, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that Israel cannot dictate its will on the Palestinian people. Israel is a very powerful country. It has atomic weapons. It's the only atomic power which does not even, which is not called upon to allow international inspection. The International Atomic Energy has never been able to inspect the atomic labs and manufacturers and industry that is within Israel. And the United States government has not been able to, but we don't hear much about a demand to do so. Although Iraq is, and Pakistan is, and South Africa is, all the other countries in the world, we talk about their potential for acquisition of atomic weapons. We don't talk about Israel. But what I'm suggesting here is that Israel is in fact a very powerful country. It can dominate the Palestinians by military force. There is no question about it. But it cannot dominate them politically. It cannot impose its will on the Palestinians. It can control them. It can imprison them. It can kill them. It can expel them, but it cannot produce the peace that it says it wants. That is to acknowledge the legitimacy of Israel and to live in peace with Israel. You cannot impose that by force. And the Intifada has demonstrated that a people who are unarmed, but who are politically powerful, who are infused by ideas, by a vision of coexistence, can in fact engage in civil disobedience and make that costly to the occupier. Israeli tanks march at will. The army is always there. They close the schools, they impose curfews. I mean, some cities have experienced curfews for sometimes for 2 months. There is a curfew almost every day somewhere in the West Bank and Gaza. All attempts at control of the population cannot lead to surrender. What Israel wants from the Palestinians is to surrender, to acknowledge that they don't exist, that they don't have a state, that they go away, they vanish, as Golda Meir wished them, or as Begin does. But you cannot produce that by force unless you kill people. Genocide is the only answer. But that's not surrender, that's genocide. But in the New World Order, you can't commit genocide. You can't Holocaust a people. And I think the recognition by Israel, as a result of this constant struggle of the Palestinians, is that in the absence of any credible force, what else is there to produce the outcome that you desire most? For the Palestinians, on the other hand, they can never have military force. They cannot impose their state by military force. They cannot produce a Palestinian state by military action. You have an impasse. Israel cannot defeat the Palestinians by military force because it has it, but it cannot produce the outcome that it desires. And the Palestinians don't have the military force, and they will not have the military force to produce the state. That's number one. Number two, I think Syria and Lebanon have recognized also that by military force alone, they cannot evict the Israeli army from the Golan or southern Lebanon. That there is no military solution to the conflict between the Palestinians and Israel, and there is no military solution to the conflict between Israel and the Arab states. And there is only one way out, and that is negotiation. A voluntary agreement between the adversaries, an agreement with which they are willing to live. I think this is the most crucial variable that has enabled the parties reluctantly to enter into the peace process. And I want to remind you of what's happening in South Africa, because South Africa is also a very powerful country. It too has been experimenting with atomic weapons. But it too recognized that it cannot keep the African people in permanent subordination to the whites. The African National Congress, that led the struggle of the African people for equality, never had the military power to alter the regime, to transform the country into a multiracial democratic structure. By struggle, they did struggle, but they could have never defeated the South African army. And both parties recognize that the way out is to enter a peace process of negotiation leading to democratic politics. This is very important. It takes time for adversaries to come to that conclusion. So there is a transition in South Africa. We may be at the beginning of a transition in the Middle East. At the beginning. What we see now is probably the final act in a process that has begun in South Africa that will be, of course, resumed after this referendum. But the negotiations that have taken place in the Middle East, and despite the fact that they are very frustrating and very slow, but I think they hold hope. Because there is no other way of resolving this conflict between the Palestinians and Israel and between Israel and the Arab states. A conflict that will bring about peace for both people must be a resolution, must be based on equality of people, of rights. And I will conclude by quoting a statement from President Wilson, who obviously it was in reference to the First World War, but it is applicable today to the two adversaries. That's about the kind of peace that is to take place between the Arabs and Israel, between the Palestinians and Israel. Only a peace between equals can last. What we have today, Israel as a dominating, occupying power, as a suppressing power, as a brutal power. There is no equality in Israel today or between Israel and the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. That's the Palestinians who live in Israel, who are citizens of Israel, have no equality. They are second-class citizens. Only a peace between equals can last. Only a peace, the very principle of which is equality and a common participation in a common benefit. But the peace and the outcome must produce something beneficial to both. It's not a peace for one. The right state of mind, the right feeling between nations is as necessary for a lasting peace as is the just settlement of vexed questions of territory or of racial and national allegiance. The equality of nations upon which peace must be founded, if it is to last, must be an equality of rights. Palestinians must have equal rights with their adversary. The Arabs must have equal rights. There is no substitute for equality. That is what we hope the peace conference will produce. Thank you.